Hey guys, it's Brie here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and today we're going to be talking about mulches, my favorite mulches, and when to use what mulch. And one of the biggest changes that we made this year at the farm, you may remember from a couple videos back, is that we got rid of all of our landscape fabric. Now, market farmers use landscape fabric a little bit different than landscapers. We don't bury it under mulch. What market farmers usually do is we put that landscape fabric over the top of the bed and it serves as a mulch. There's pros and cons to this. The pro is that it's faster than hand applying mulch around each individual plant. It's also something you can reuse every year, and it's a semi-permanent option. The cons are that it's made out of plastic. There's considerations with it breaking down into microplastics in the soil. There's VOCs that are emitted when we burn the holes for the fabric, and also it takes petroleum, obviously, to produce a plastic product. So I also aesthetically don't like the look of it. So this year we got rid of the last of our landscape fabric, and I'm so happy that we did. So yes, you could use landscape fabric if you want. Definitely don't bury it under your mulch. That mulch just breaks down on top of the landscape fabric and it turns into a weedy mess. Just don't do it. You could use it on top of the soil. The downside is that I don't like that our birds don't have access to this soil when we're doing that. What I found really interestingly is that when we pulled up all of our landscape fabric, we had a huge influx of robins in our field. Because there was so much soil for them to go through, they were having a blast going through finding worms and caterpillars and grubs. So this is the great thing about having birds in your garden, is they're really key to pest prevention without having to use pesticides. So having a natural mulch that they're able to get through is helpful in that way versus the landscape fabric. Now, we had used it because we have bindweed, and we still have some bindweed. We have systematically reduced the amount of bindweed that we have through the constant smothering and pulling of it, but this year we are switching to full deep mulch systems. The benefits of using natural mulches is that it actually breaks down and feeds the soil life as it does break down. So we have to use mulch here. I saw something the other day where someone said they don't like to use mulch because they don't like the look of it. Well, to me, the benefits outweigh the costs if you're concerned about the aesthetics of mulch. So the reasons that we use it here at the farm is that we're in a fairly dry climate. We have drought often, and so we have to be water wise. So mulch is a really important part of that. The thicker the mulch layer we have on top of the soil, the more moisture stays in the soil, the more the soil food web stays happy, because those microbes don't like to be exposed to dryness, to UV rays. They don't like temperature fluctuations. And when you have exposed, naked, bare soil, they get a lot of temperature fluctuations. That can kill off the soil life in those top few inches of soil, which leads to poor soil health, poor plant health, pest pressures, drought intolerance, all kinds of problems. So we want to keep that soil life intact, and mulch is a really key way to do it. So I'm going to be talking about different kinds of mulches. I'm going to go through my favorite mulches for perennial beds and for annual beds. We're going to start with perennials. Now, perennial bed mulch is a little bit different because it's somewhat permanent. So there are a couple of things that I like to use in the perennial areas. Number one is wood chips, and wood chips are very easily available. You can sign up for free wood chips on chipdrop.com. Sometimes you'll get like big logs and sticks and things, and you have to sift through it. So just know that if you get free chip drops, sometimes you get free logs as well. But one thing that you should be mindful of if you are planning on using wood chips or wood mulch is that you want to avoid the dyed mulches, and I'll tell you why. Dyed mulches can be great because they look very aesthetically pleasing if you want a certain look, black or red mulch. The downside is that it's not actually the dyes that we're worried about. The dyes are actually non-toxic, they're pretty safe. What we're concerned about is that when our mulches are dyed, they are able to use different wood products in the mulch because it's all getting dyed the same color. So often what will happen is they chip up pallets and old lumber from building projects and things that have been treated. And we don't want to be using chemical treated wood in the garden. So if you're going to use wood chips, I always recommend getting your wood chips from an arborist and making sure that they're from a tree. And if you absolutely have to have the dyed mulch, go with one that is MSC certified. That's going to ensure that you don't have those chemical treated lumber products in your mulch. The other thing that I like to use for mulches in perennial areas are living plants. So living ground covers, things like creeping phlox is native to my area and is fairly drought tolerant. Wine cups is another one. Finding something that is low, creeping, spreading ground cover can work really well around perennial plants. You do want to make sure that you're not selecting something that's overly aggressive or a non-native that can be invasive. So be mindful when you're doing this. But for example, in the areas where we pulled up all of the landscape fabric around our peonies, we're putting in creeping phlox in between, and I think it's going to make a beautiful carpet of blooms, and it's going to help feed the ecosystem, so it's a win-win. Let's move on to annual mulches. I'm going to go through my 6 favorite mulches for annual plants. So we're talking about annual cutting gardens or your raised beds or your vegetable gardens. A disclaimer, even though some of these are my least favorite, I will still use them occasionally because I tend to use whatever I have on hand. If I happen to have a bunch of pine straw on hand, I'll use that. If I happen to have a bunch of leaves, I'll use that. It's kind of whatever I happen to have, I will use, but I am gonna rank them from least favorite to most. So coming in at number 6 is shredded newspaper. And we've used shredded newspaper because it comes, actually some of our plants, when we order wholesale from our native nursery, they come packed in shredded newspaper to help keep them moist. Shredded newspaper works well as a mulch. It's still breathable. So solid newspaper can be kind of bad because it forms a sheet and it can suffocate out the top layers of the soil. Shredded newspaper still is breathable and permeable, both to air and to water. So shredded newspaper, not just solid layers of it. The downside of using newspaper is that it's hard to find these days. A lot of people don't get newspapers anymore. And also the question of what is in paper products. And if you've watched our PFAS in the garden video, you know that I am very wary about putting paper products in my garden. Paper that includes cardboard, so I don't use cardboard, for example, if I'm doing a no-dig garden. And the reason for that is because paper mills have been found to be one of the biggest contributors to PFAS in the water supply, and there's just a lot of unknowns about whether the pulp has been bleached with bleach, which can lead to dioxin buildup in the soil. There's just a lot of unknowns whenever we're looking at using a man-made material. So this is why I limit the use of paper products, especially in my edible gardens. So perennial or ornamental gardens, maybe you're not so concerned about it, which is actually where we used newspaper, was in our front perennial prairie area. It doesn't look very great, so that's the other downside. It kind of looks a little bit messy, but if you top it with a layer of leaves or shredded bark, you can't even see it anymore. So if you have some of that, I'd say feel free to use it, but it's my least favorite. Coming in at number 5 is straw. Straw is a very popular garden mulch. It's probably the one I see used the most, and that's because it's very readily available. So you can walk into most garden centers and grab a bale of straw. It's fairly inexpensive, and a little bit goes a long way. The downsides of straw are a couple of things. If you put it down in a wind storm, you know that your mulch is here one day and gone the next. So its tendency to blow away with wind is a con. Also, the fact that it can be very heavily contaminated with weed seeds. The grass will start to sprout in your garden. Even if it's guaranteed seed-free, we found that they all tend to sprout some amount of seeds, which is fine. They're easy to pull, but it's kind of a pain. They can also be contaminated with more noxious weeds, and they can be contaminated with herbicide. And herbicide to me is the biggest problem with straw because it's very hard to know if your straw is contaminated with herbicide until your plants start to die. And once you start to see plant die off, that means that that herbicide has worked its way into your soil, and it can be there for a long time. So Grazon in particular is very persistent. It's a persistent herbicide. So I've seen fellow farmers whose fields have been ruined using straw that was contaminated with herbicide, and it's just impossible to tell. I would say if you are going to use straw as a mulch, make sure that you can get whoever's selling it to you to guarantee you that it was not contaminated with herbicide. And if they cannot guarantee you that, preferably in writing, don't buy it. But straw is inexpensive, so that's the pro. Although I have seen bagged straw sell for over $100 for a bag. It's crazy to me, but anyway. Coming in at number 4, pine shavings. This is one that I don't see used often in the garden, which is very surprising to me because pine shavings are very readily available. You can get them at any Tractor Supply or feed store. They're usually what's used in chicken coops for chicken bedding, and they're very inexpensive. I think 8 cubic feet of pine shavings in my area is $10. Very inexpensive, very lightweight, easy to spread, doesn't blow away. For me, the pine shavings seem to stay in place even though they're fairly lightweight. They form a really nice consistent surface, so it looks nice, and it's also very difficult for weeds to germinate in pine shavings. Pine shavings also smell really nice, which is another advantage. If you have chickens, you can use their bedding from the coop, even though it has manure and stuff in there. You can use that as a mulch in your garden. I would just recommend aging it for a few months first so that it's not too hot and it doesn't burn your plants, and also so that you avoid any pathogen issues with too fresh of manure. Age it first if you're going to use it as a mulch if it contains your chicken manure. Coming in at number 3, now we are getting to the ones that are my favorite because they are free or cheaper. Okay, so up until now, these have mostly been ones that we've had to pay for or acquire in some way. These next ones are my favorite because they're readily available to me. So again, bear in mind what is readily available to you. Your top favorite mulch might change. It might be different than mine. Coming in at number 3 for me is leaves. Now every year we do a big leaf collection in my neighborhood. Everyone knows they can just bag up their leaves in compostable bags, drop them on my driveway, and I will take all of the leaves, give them all to me. I think last year we collected over 500 bags, and they all live in my yard until the spring. And what we do is we just build leaf towers. We fill up those leaf towers with the leaves, and in the late spring, so after the temperatures have warmed up to around 60 degrees consistently, then we mulch up those leaves and we use them as mulch in the garden. I love them because they're free. We are doing something good for the ecosystem. There's lots of insects and pollinators that use fallen leaves as habitat to lay eggs in. Their larvae are in there, and so by leaving them whole and not mulching them until the spring, we're giving those pollinators a chance to hatch and emerge in the spring before we use them in the garden. Leaves break down quickly in the soil, which is why they're good for annual beds. We do use them occasionally in the perennial areas and in walkways, but they do break down pretty quickly, so we have to reapply every year versus the wood chips that hold up for longer. The great thing about leaves is that they're usually not going to contain any weed seeds, although you do have to be careful if you're getting them from your neighbors that they're not raking them up with any kind of noxious weed seeds and putting that in the bag with your leaves. Also, make sure that you're not using leaves that have come from trees that have been treated for any kind of pests. Sometimes people spray their trees for certain bugs, so just make sure that you're not using leaves that were treated with pesticides. Coming in at number 2 is pine straw, and pine straw is just a fancy term for pine needles. And we use mostly ponderosa pine needles, and the reason that I love these are they're free. I don't have to worry about herbicide contamination. I don't have to worry about weed seeds germinating from them. So my parents actually live in the mountains. They have a lot of ponderosa pine on their property, and they have to rake up the needles every year as part of their wildfire mitigation for their insurance. So whenever they bag them up, I take them happily because they are a great mulch. I really like that they provide shade for younger plantings. So things like our lisianthus that stay very small for a long time and don't like to have hot roots, if I mulch them with something like leaves, that can be too thick for them and it can actually suffocate them and keep them from getting sunlight. So for the younger plants especially, I really like the pine straw. They're able to grow up and through it. They still get a little bit of dappled light. It can help with things like transplant shock. And it is a myth that pine straw will acidify your soil. It's been studied. University of New Hampshire has a great paper about it. I'll link it below that you can read. But really what happens is pine trees grow in acid soil. They don't make the soil acidic. They happen to select a spot that is good for them, and that's the area that they'll thrive. Usually people have trouble planting under pine trees because the soil is dry. It's not because it's acidic. So using pine straw on your garden is totally fine. Same for pine shavings. It's not going to acidify your soil. So if you have alkaline soil, don't get excited thinking that pine straw is going to help acidify it. It's not. I feel like we need a drum roll for my number 1 favorite mulch. My number 1 favorite mulch in the garden is cover crop residue. So you may have seen our video where we showed how we do our spring cover crop. It's coming along nicely. We're going to terminate it in a couple of weeks. But what I prefer when I have the choice is to grow my cover crop in the fall, have it be something that will winter kill, which means that when the temperatures get cold enough, that crop dies on its own. And then in the spring, there's still a residue on the top surface of the soil that I can plant into. The reason that I like cover crops the best is because it's inexpensive. So to bring in seed, I don't have to bring in much material. I'm not having to ship straw, for example, from somewhere far away. I just need the seed And I'm also doing something really good for my soil. So the mix that I prefer to use in the fall is a mix of oats, peas, radish, and turnip. Because I have clay soil, that helps to break up the soil. It adds a little bit of nitrogen, and it also puts some organic matter down into the soil. Because I don't like to use a lot of compost on my soil, I rely on those cover crops. In the spring, once it's died back, there's a nice layer on top of the soil of that residue from the cover crop that just serves as the mulch. So I just scooch it aside, plant right into that residue, and we're done. So in this regenerative garden space, we are always trying to think about serving the soil, feeding the soil first. So out of all these mulches, yes, the natural mulches are all going to feed the soil. But if we're thinking from the soil food web perspective, the cover crop is going to be the best because those roots are the base of the soil food web. If the roots are in the soil, especially those living roots, for longer in the season, then we're going to have more active soil life. So this is why cover crops are my favorite mulch for the annual garden and why living plants are my favorite mulch for the perennial garden. But remember, it all comes down to what you have on hand. The most ecologically friendly thing in the garden to do is to use what you have. So whatever you can use on site that doesn't require you to go out and buy something is always gonna win in my book. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe below, and we will see you back at the farm for more fun soon.